Hello again, everyone. I'm John Ray, the sponsor and producer of this series, North Fulton Voices. Welcome back. Today we offer part 2 of the interview that we had with Kyle Wingfield of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. The interview with Kyle went so well, and there were so many insights shared that we decided to let the recording run and continue the conversation. If you missed part 1, what you missed were Kyle's insights around the impact of government regulations on housing costs, the definition and challenges of middle-income housing, and the broader implications of local policies on housing affordability. Those were just a few of the topics that Kyle touched on during his conversation with Jack Murphy and Nancy Diamond of the North Fulton Improvement Network. If you missed part 1 of the interview, go to your favorite podcast app and search for North Fulton Voices, and you'll find the series. While you're there, subscribe to the show so you don't miss any episodes as we go forward. Now, here is part 2 of the interview with Kyle, and we'll pick up with Jack Murphy asking Kyle about Governor Kemp's Rural Housing Initiative. Enjoy.
I was very excited when Governor Kemp announced his rural housing program. That would count Dawsonville, but how is that going, and what's been the impact on maybe the psychology at the General Assembly? Are they more open to these kinds of programs?
Yeah, I think it's a little too soon to say. Certainly that the focus from a funding standpoint has been on infrastructure. So if you think about that Hyundai plant down outside of Savannah, if you're accommodating tens of thousands of new workers and the homes that are going to be required, there's water and sewer infrastructure, road infrastructure, all utility, all sorts of things that have to go in before you ever start moving dirt to build a house or an apartment building or whatever it might be. So the focus has been on that, but that has to, the community has to allow for the rezoning and that type of thing for those projects to move forward, to need the infrastructure. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, I think, and I don't know that we're far enough along on it, or I'm not aware anyway, that we're of being far enough along on it to really see whether the money available for the infrastructure is convincing local governments to make changes in terms of what they're allowing and the speed at which they're allowing new projects to go up. In terms of the attitude at the General Assembly, we're a home rule state in our Constitution. There's a lot of deference in the General Assembly to local governments. Many of the members of the General Assembly come out of that, right? They were city council members or mayors or county commissioners. And generally speaking, I agree with that viewpoint. I think the government that governs closest to the people governs best. And at a minimum, if that's where the decision-making is, if it's a bad decision, it's easier to leave and go somewhere else. And it's easier to vote those people out and vote somebody else in. So the smaller, in terms of the size, the radius of the government, the more local it is, the easier it is to adjust when there are problems. But we see that deference in the General Assembly. There have been a couple of bills over the last couple of years that would require or prohibit local governments when it comes to require them to do certain things or prohibit them from doing certain things, or even to incentivize them to do some things. And we haven't seen those move forward. I think there's a little bit of a waiting period to see, do things get better with these, like with the infrastructure money, that sort of thing? Does the conversation advance enough in some areas that some local governments are making different choices that accommodate more growth and more building? And then if it doesn't, what's the next step going to be?
So we see a lot, like I have family in California, and the state has issued regulations that supersede the local governments on single family zoning, size of affordability percentages, all that kind of thing. I don't think North Fulton's ready to accept anything like that. And certainly those states there's cities that have outlawed single family zoning, and I don't believe we're there. But how do you go about, and what is the economic development outreach case for helping people understand and help give those elected officials cover to do what they need to do.
Yeah, and those states haven't really solved their problem either. So they're not a great model. I think conversations like this, the work that y'all are doing, just to try to educate people about what needs to happen, what the benefits of that would be. There are things that I think people don't necessarily understand. You look around, certainly a lot of parts of Metro Atlanta, in the city of Atlanta where I live, cranes and new construction going on all the time. And you think, oh, we're building. You can drive up I-75 into Northwest Georgia and you hit Cartersville, Calhoun, Dalton, big building projects going up all near the interstate. And you think, what's everybody talking about? We're building plenty of new housing. I think most people would be surprised at a minimum to learn that we're still not building as many new homes in the state of Georgia as we were in 2005. That we have not reached that annual number a single time. We peaked in 2005, and we've not really come close to it since. Now, that was right prior to the Great Recession. A lot of builders went out of business. There were a lot of dislocation in the industry and the financial crisis, all that. Yes, of course. It's been, 14 years now since the Great Recession officially ended. We've added 2 million people to our state since then. I think people have a false sense of how much is going on versus what's required to address the problem. And the other thing is this is a relatively new problem in Georgia. Because we were building at such levels throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, this was always a state where people moved because it was affordable, and housing was a key part of that. So this is a relatively new problem. People haven't necessarily been presented with the facts about how pervasive a problem it is. And so I think it takes people like what you're doing here and that our group is working on just to educate people about, no, the problem is real and it's going to take some change. And the right time to change was probably 10 years ago. Or 5 years ago, but we're here today. Better to change now than 5 years or 10 years from now, because then you do get stuck in where the Californias are, where the remedy becomes so drastic and so counter to what most people really would like to have. You don't want to get to that point. And I think people need to understand we're closer to that type of situation than maybe they appreciate.
That's interesting. It's a point that we try to figure out how to get across. When you look at even the houses that are being built, they're largely being absorbed by the folks that are moving in who have higher incomes than the current population does, because it's still cheaper than where they're coming from. And so what gets lost in that discussion of, even when we start doing more houses, is it geared for who we need to have living in our communities? How do you get that across?
I was a moderator on a panel that the Council for Quality Growth had a couple of months ago. I guess it was back in August. And Mayor Rusty Paul of Sandy Springs was there. And housing affordability was one of the topics that we were talking about. And he said, look, in our community, you've had people taking $500,000 homes, tearing them down and building $1.25 million homes. And now he said, now that's just moving up, right? You have people tearing down more and more expensive homes to build even more and more expensive homes. And yeah, so there's building going on, but it's not necessarily increasing the housing stock. And it's certainly not at price points where those median income workers can find something that they can afford. So yeah, even the amount of building that we have can be deceptive sometimes.
And that's one of the things we're hoping to get across is that cluster castle concept could be a triplex, or you could have more volume in there.
That's right. It's not all 10-story apartment buildings, right? Certainly I am not saying that's appropriate everywhere, all over the place. It may look a little different from what you have now in some places, and it's not going to be every neighborhood that's going to look different, right? But there's going to be some parts of town that will look different. And that's why it's appropriate that the local community and the local government has that power to decide what needs to go where. But there has to be a decision, right? I think when what we're seeing too often is not wanting to allow change anywhere. And that's leading to the problem. And again, if I often tell people who are more conservative leaning like myself, there's a lot of times where there would have been an acceptable answer to something and we just said no to it. And then we end up with a way less acceptable answer eventually because the problem doesn't go away. It only gets worse, and people eventually want whatever someone is touting that will solve the problem. So if there's a acceptable, maybe not perfect, maybe not exactly how you draw it up type of answer, but it's acceptable, maybe try that rather than holding out. You just can't say no forever. And if there's something on the table, take the win when you can get it.
Been Nancy's point for 2 years. Just, okay, if you say no, tell me your plan.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I get that the amateur psychologist in me says there's no reward for doing something different. When you look at tax rolls increase with those $1 million mansions that just replaced a $500,000 mansion, elected officials say, look at how flush we are. And so there's got to be something at the next level that says, but we can't find bus drivers to take our kids to school. And that's what we're trying to get people to. We're not trying to say no to the great growth, because I certainly look at my Zillow report every month and say, Yahoo. But I also look at who can't live here and think we need those.
Yep.
So I think about it as the triangle of regulation, zoning, and demand, increased demand. Where do you prioritize, or is there a leading of those three that you focus on more, or do you try to push all three?
It probably depends on the community, but I think here's what I would say. If in your community you have leaders who are saying, we need to solve this problem, then the first thing they need to do is ask themselves, how are we making it worse? Is our permitting process slower than it needs to be? Because that time is money when you're in the building industry, and the cost of carrying capital and waiting. It's the one thing that in our survey we were actually really surprised came out so low. And I wonder if the question maybe doesn't get at it, because that was the biggest gap between what we found and what we were hearing anecdotally is the cost of delays. But certainly, are we doing, if there's a project that it's zoned properly, there's somebody wanting to build it, are we making sure we're not standing in the way from a permitting perspective? I think I hear a lot of horror stories from the inspection side of things where, especially in multifamily, redevelopments, that type of thing, where the code might get applied arbitrarily or could be interpreted one way, and the inspector chooses to interpret it in a less favorable way, and that ends up costing money. I've heard lots of horror stories from builders and developers about that. And then just, are your fees and your processes and everything, your other processes, as reasonable as they can be? Again, we're not saying government should impose no cost. There are certain of these things where there's a hard cost involved. If the builder or the homeowner doesn't bear it, then it's going to fall on the taxpayers, and we're certainly not advocating for that. But is it as reasonable as it can be? Is the process as efficient as it can be? And so that would be the first thing. And then the second thing, I think, would be to look at what types of building or development are we allowing or not, and the zoning comes into play with that.
So do you have a sense about what kind of housing types are most needed or preferred? Or there's the easy thing the cities in town seems to go to is big apartments, and clearly that's not something we have an appetite here for. But is it single family? Is it smaller, garaged, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, again, I think it's community by community, but I think what you want to have is you want to have options, right? I think a lot of people focus on home ownership. And certainly in our society, that's a key way to build wealth and really important. But not everybody's ready to own a home. Not everybody's ready for all the expense that comes along with owning a home. And boy, those first few years of owning your own home are a real eye-opener in terms of the time and the money and everything it costs to to keep it up, much less if something unexpected goes wrong. Not everybody's ready for that. So that you need to have, I think, robust rental options, because I don't know anybody, I can't think of anybody I know who the first home they lived in as an adult, they owned, right? Everybody rents something at some level, and it's part of how you build toward the ability to move into home ownership. So I think that tends to become a binary thing. And I think within a community, you want options, because it for many people, some people are happy renting their whole lives, but for many people, that's part of the path to home ownership. So if you say you want home ownership, you need the path for people to get there. I think that, so then when you get into that, then you get into single family, multifamily. Again, that can be part of a path for people too. They start in more of a multifamily and then move into single family. That can be from community to community. Again, would never try to force a particular solution onto any particular community. But I think just having the options, it doesn't all have to be, again, 10-story huge apartment buildings. It can be little garden apartment buildings. When I mentioned I lived in Montgomery, I lived in a little complex that was 4 apartments to a building, and I think 5 or 6 of those buildings. Very small scale in a lot of ways, but it was the type of option that I could afford and was looking for at that point in my life. And it was reasonable enough. It's part of how I saved, and eventually was able to buy something years in a side trip to Europe a little later. But I think that's the main thing. And then when you get to the owner occupied housing too, the starter home versus the forever home type of thing. The aging of the population is going to have an impact here too, as people age and live in their homes longer. They don't necessarily want to stay in the large home that they had when it was full of kids and dogs and everything else.
Yeah, that's what we're finding as the boomers are exiting the workplace. And certainly that's true of North Fulton, who grew so exponentially off of folks who are now our age. How prevalent is that around other regions? Is it pretty consistent?
So I saw a fascinating statistic recently, and I don't remember the numbers exactly off the top of my head, so I'm just going to characterize it here. But it was basically a demand curve for housing by age, or owned housing. I think it was home ownership by age. Percentage of, yeah, that's what it was. I'm sorry. It's taken me a long time to explain. It was percentage of people at any given age who own their own homes. Mm-hmm. And historically, that number has risen. And then somewhere in the early to mid 60s of age, it starts to drop off. And the point that this economist was making was that curve is not curving down these days. And it's people staying in their homes longer. It's second homes. It's people owning short-term rental properties, whatever it might be. And he was forecasting that it's something like 1 million more homes are needed nationwide because of just this trend changing and people as they age not following earlier patterns of behavior when it comes to home ownership. So there are things like that certainly are having an effect. And that's one reason that when the government's putting a lot of restrictions or regulations or whatever on the market, you want the market to be able to respond to market conditions. That's the main thing. If you need more homes, you need to be able to build more homes. If you don't need more, it needs to be able to stop too. It would be just as bad if they said, you have to build all these homes. If they're not needed, that's not good either. The participants in the market are best able to respond to those conditions. And so that's a great example of how things are changing, and you need builders and everyone else to be able to respond.
So there's been this continuing conversation as long as I've been in adult life in Georgia about if you're not growing, you're dying. We've got to continue to push the economic development. And we've certainly done that. We've certainly done a great job of that. Is there any NIMBY kind of economic development NIMBYs that are starting to say we've gone too far? Are you seeing any pushback?
Yeah, I think some of that growth fatigue I was talking about earlier is a part of that, definitely, where they say, how much is enough? I think the way I would respond to that is, I think you want the problems that come with growth, not the problems that come with stagnation. You'd rather be Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, with all of the traffic and everything else that comes with it than Detroit, right? I think we would probably all agree with that. Can you do it in a way that can it be managed or channeled or something? Or maybe, sure. And I think, again, rather than a handful of elected officials or bureaucrats trying to decide that, it's better to let people vote with their feet and the market respond to that. But I think we will, if we take a lot of action to slow the growth down intentionally, we'll look back very ruefully one day in the future.
And I think we don't see a lot of the businesses that don't stay, that aren't making it, that don't. We do a lot of ribbon cuttings around here, but when it comes to a point where they can't get the workers and they move in town, and I'm thinking of a couple big ones that we could name, we didn't hear about that. They just quietly left. And so I think that replacement factor has to be a portion of it. But I just wonder, in economic development world where housing seems to have risen to the top, where education used to be the top factor, is that changing the strategy of economic development in Georgia? Are they being more targeted about how they go about bringing in business?
I don't know that it's happening yet, but I think there will probably come a day sooner than later when the state's economic development officials are negotiating with a new employer and a community. Part of the negotiation will be, and what is your plan to accommodate the growth, whether it's housing, transportation, water and sewer, whatever it is, what is your plan to do that, and what is your commitment to doing that? Because I can tell you, the state officials that do these deals do not like having these situations where the people who were in the room with them saying, yes, we want this. Yes, we want the ribbon cutting, right? We want then turn around and try to build a moat around their community as soon as the ribbon has been cut. So I don't know that there's been a policy change yet, but I would not be surprised to see that happen very soon.
And I think an important part of what you just said was, and your commitment to it, because there's a fair amount of promises that are made that say, Rivian, when you build your plant, look at all this land we have. Eventually, the workers start moving far enough out that they're no longer interested in driving in. One of the things that I think is a real problem that you really can't deny in North Fulton is the cost of land. And it does prohibit an awful lot of the things that people, even well-meaning people, might want to do. We've been talking a lot about alternative models. There's an organization, a national organization that has an office here that suggests we start building over church parking lots. They're doing that downtown in some places. Woodstock just changed its zoning laws to allow auxiliary dwelling units, little houses on the property. Has your organization taken a look at some of those alternatives?
We have, and it's not the kind of thing, again, where we're endorsing any particular type of solution or go to a community and say, here's the answer for you. But we've seen things like tiny homes, especially when I remember talking with someone in a more rural city who said, we'll get medical residents in our hospital and there's nowhere for them to rent. Or if they want to have a pet, there's nowhere they can rent and have a pet. And they end up living 20 or 30 miles away and driving in because of that. And he was suggesting that maybe tiny homes would be a solution for something like that. I think when you talk about the change that we need to have on the scale that we need to have it, and it's somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of homes statewide that we're missing. We're actually working on a study right now that kind of surveys various estimates of it, and it's not done yet, unfortunately. I wish I had it to share with you today, but again, for statewide, it's going to be in the hundreds of thousands, somewhere between 100 and 300 probably. It's going to take all sorts of solutions, and the other thing it's going to take is doing things differently. We will not traditionally build enough new single-family homes to catch up with increase in demand and make up for the demand that we haven't been meeting over the past 15 years or 20 years. So you see things like manufactured housing not necessarily your double wide trailer that people probably bring to mind when I say something like that, maybe in some places, but there are an increasing number of companies that are building homes off-site, bringing them in. I've walked around in them. You would not know it wasn't built the traditional way. You would think someone had spent 9 months putting this thing up, framing up the walls and everything. And in fact, it was built in a few weeks in a factory and then brought in on a flatbed truck and installed. And it's not mobile because it's not going anywhere, right? It is as permanent as any other structure is meant to be there, but it's built in a fraction of the amount of time and with a fraction of the labor, and therefore at a fraction of the cost. And some acceptance of things like that. We worked with a city council member on the south side who would like to see more homes built out of shipping containers in her community. People hear that again, and if they haven't spent, you can spend 3 seconds Googling it and you realize it's nothing like what first pops in your mind.
Yes.
Because I remember when I first heard it, I thought that sounds terrible. And then you Google it and you look at some of the things they're doing with this material and you think, oh, that's not at all what I had in mind, right? So there are lots of different things, I think. And again, I think every community can customize it to their own need. But you brought up the land issue, and I've talked about labor. There was a study committee that the State House had several years ago looking at workforce housing, and they identified 4 L's: land, labor, lumber, and laws. Since then, with the way interest rates have gone, you could add a 5th L, lending. But those are really the policy levers that are involved here. There's not a lot they're not making more land, right? There's not a lot you can do about that. Labor is part of a bigger system that is really hard to attack at a local or even state level. Lumber, you're talking about international trade in a lot of cases. So laws that's what you have, right? I come back to where we started, that there are things that government's doing now to make the problem worse that first do no harm. First stop doing those things, and then we can talk about all these other solutions.
Is this the Georgia House study that you're referencing, or is that a different one?
Yes, I think it's from 2018,
yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, there was that big study on workforce housing that the state legislature produced. I think it was published after it went through the machinations in 2020 or end of 2019. But do you see that, A, being updated since we've come a long way, or B, have you seen it impacting policy yet?
It's certainly contributed to those conversations that are going on, right? Similar to the work we've done and some others, it's gotten people talking, and that's always the first step. You got to get people talking, and then you have to, again, back to disagreeing better. You have to hear the other side and hear what they're really saying, right? What are they really objecting to? And then how can you accommodate that as much as possible in getting to the solution? So we're still in the listening and accommodating phase, I think, of policymaking. And we're not quite to the, okay, here's how we go forward, having heard those objections and accommodating them as long as it's not just don't do anything less than that. How can we accommodate it as much as possible and come up with a solution that's going to actually solve the problem? So we're somewhere in that middle ground, I would say, in the policymaking process.
So I feel like the terminology alone, you can't even get through the terminology of what we're discussing without that becoming political. Is it affordable? Is it attainable? Is it workforce? Is it hero? And we keep changing it to try to be less political. Are you seeing this become any more bipartisan, or is there, when you say sides, is there what's the politics around it?
Yeah. I think this is an issue that's fun to work on because it doesn't fall along the normal fault lines that you see in politics. It's not really a left-right issue. Now, it's election day as we record this, so I'm reminded everything eventually becomes a left-right issue, but it really isn't yet. I would say it's much more a top-down divide. It's between people who have or see a path to the housing that they need and people who don't. And that really cuts across left and right. People left and right on both sides of that divide. And so I really think it's a top-down type of divide. and which makes it unique and fun to work on because we're a nonpartisan organization. But I can tell you, when it comes to a lot of the education and healthcare and tax types of issues we work on, it's red team, blue team, it's left where everybody falls to start with. It's nice to work on an issue that's a little jumbled up from that perspective, and that offers different obstacles but different opportunities too.
That is a great ending, I think, on Election Day to talk about the optimistic idea that maybe we can cross aisles. Kyle, this has been fascinating. Thanks so much for your time. Nancy, do you have any call to action?
Yes, I think the bottom line for us is getting it circulated as a topic, getting conversation going. And we're a very type A community. We like to see a problem, get it done, check it off the list. And this is a little longer range, longer timeline than that. And it's a struggle. But we ask people to go see for yourself. Go online and search for homes in the local area for the price range of our median income, about $100,000 you can put it in. And then that home price is about $300,000 to $350,000, and see how many choices there are and what shape are they in. Are they move-in ready, or are they going to need huge renovation? Are they houses, condos, townhomes? How does that work? Same thing with rent. Find out what's under $2,500 a month. How big is it? How many bedrooms? Would it be suitable for a family? So, Kyle, did you have one more?
I was just going to say, and after you've done that and realized how big the problem is, go to georgiapolicy.org and read the studies and all the things that we've written about it. You can read the white paper itself, or we always have a little more accessible commentary or overview of it. But yeah, would love for people to take that and then contact us with any questions they have.
Absolutely. And we'll link to that in our show notes as well. We also encourage people to get involved in local planning discussions, read your city's comprehensive plan, which is the legal basis for zoning, and ask questions. Just ask, what's the plan? You don't have to know the answer. You just have to ask and have that seat at the table that isn't often represented at meetings. Our 6 cities, all cities have to go through an update every 5 years. And the next one up is Roswell in the next coming months. And Alpharetta, I think, is not too far behind. So get involved in that. This is, as we said, it's not a quick fix, which makes it especially challenging. In the short term, it's listening, learning, sharing information with others. We're hoping to move past no and get on with those options that we can agree on. So thanks so much for being here, Kyle, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, Kyle, this has been great. Thank you so much for being here. And let's just give your coordinates one more time for those that want to be in touch and learn about the Georgia Public Policy Foundation and the work you do that goes well beyond housing. You're into a lot of different issues and concerns.
Absolutely. No, thank you for having me today. And you can find us at georgiapolicy.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter with the handle Georgia Policy. And you can sign up for our weekly email, the Friday Facts, at our website. That gives you a weekly update of everything we're working on, things we see going on around the state and nation that are relevant. And would love for people to sign up, get their updates that way, and then reach out to us.
Kyle, thanks again. Kyle Wingfield, the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. And again, thanks to Nancy Diamond, to Jack Murphy. Great show today. This has been fantastic. And I'm not going to say that. I'm going to edit that. I was going to say we're going to split this up, but we don't need to say that. Okay. And hey, folks, before we let you go for today, just a quick reminder that this show, North Fulton Voices, is presented by the North Fulton Improvement Network. Go to improvenorthfulton.org to learn more. You can get more information there as well. North Fulton Voices is the go-to source for in-depth analysis and discussion of the North Fulton missing middle housing crisis and livability challenges that are confronting this region. So keep listening as we understand the implications of the problem, explore innovative solutions, and examine why housing solutions for this area are so vital for the future. You can find the show on your favorite podcast app. Please subscribe while you're there. Apple, Spotify, all the major apps. And this show is sponsored and offered as a service to the community by yours truly, John Ray, and the North Fulton affiliate of Business RadioX. So for Jack Murphy and Nancy Diamond, I'm John Ray. Join us next time here on North Fulton Voices.
Thank you for joining us on North Fulton Voices. This show is presented by the North Fulton Improvement Network, working to solve our community's workforce housing challenges. For more information, visit improvenorthfulton.org.